Welcome to HASP, everyone. We're really pleased to see you all here this morning. And my name is Jan Fike, and I'm the coordinator for this series of classes. You know, this is 3 sessions, so we're really fortunate to have Clay here for 3 sessions. First of all, I have to remind everybody to turn off their cell phone. And so we have no ding-a-lings while we're listening and talking. And then I want to talk about Clay a little bit. Clay Stauffer is our presenter today. He's a member of HASP, and this is his 4th presentation. Can you imagine? 4 times already. So we're really fortunate to have him again. He graduated from Haverford College and then was 19 years, had a newspaper career, including 11 years as publisher of the Holland Sentinel. I remember that. I do remember that. He earned a BFA from Kendall College of Art and Design, an MFA from the University of Chicago, and then subsequently taught studio art and senior thesis courses at Kendall and maintained a studio art practice. Well, today is session 1, of course, and this is a little bit of a summary of what we're going to hear today. Technological breakthroughs in the late 19th and early 20th centuries made possible the development of motion pictures as an independent medium. The narrative conventions, cinematic techniques, and editing that made film comprehensible to audiences had to be invented. We'll look at the early years of motion pictures, focusing on the Nickelodeon era, which began about 1905. And then Clay has suggested that if you have questions during the presentation, that he will take the questions right at that time, or you can wait till the end, whatever you prefer. But if you do have a question, want to make a comment during the presentation, please raise your hand. And I'm going to be seated in the back with a microphone because we want to make sure everybody can hear what's going on. So let's give Clay a welcome here.
Can everybody hear me okay now? Okay, good. Well, welcome, first of all, because when I thought about this course and worked with Sarah Briggs to get the idea going, I wasn't sure how much interest there would be, but I'm glad there's some interest in it, because the more I looked into it, the more I could see that it was really the foundation of a lot of our visual understanding of the world around us. And that's sort of going to be part of the argument that I'm going to make today. So, yes, and if you have any questions or comments or thoughts or anything, you know, I'd rather this, I didn't write a doctoral thesis on this topic, and I don't have a film as a lifelong career, so I'm not a guru. I'm just somebody who's really interested in it, and we could talk about it. So if you have any questions, please just, chances are it's something really important that I might have overlooked or haven't really given enough attention to. So before we get going really into this, just kind of an overview, we're talking about fundamentally a technological developments that occurred in the mid-19th century and culminated in moving pictures. And we'll review that as we go along here. But first, I want to talk about why do this? Why show up for this class? Why spend a lot of time studying silent film? And some people make the argument that silent film is the purest form of cinema. In fact, when sound on film came along in the late 20s, there were a number of critics one school of thought was, this is not a good thing. Why do we need sound? Because we have a perfectly good, wonderful artistic medium here. Why do we want to add sound and mess it all up? Chances are we don't look at it that way. Sound design in films has now gotten so sophisticated that it's hard for me to imagine film without sound. But if you had never known film with sound, then you would probably think otherwise. One thing that I think is really important is cinema is in some ways the opposite of stage theater. Although, as we'll see, the early cinematographers based their presentations on stage cinema or stage presentations. In cinema, the camera, that is the audience, has freedom of movement through the directorial function. That is, you can really see it in films nowadays, the number of shots in any one scene. The camera is constantly moving, trying to optimize the viewpoint of the spectator. And as we'll see in early film, that wasn't the case. It was Méliès, for instance, never moved the camera. And it was, and we'll try to see how this understanding changed. In theater, of course, the audience is stationary and the actors move. In most theater productions, or at least conventionally, you have a new set that's put in and so forth. So in some ways, the two are very similar, but in some ways, the two different forms of dramatic presentation are completely different. One thing that is so profound, and we'd have to remember this, so hard to do, is that in early cinema, directors, and that really wasn't a job title until probably the 20s, they were creating something from scratch. The world knew painting, the classical, neoclassical painters who would paint historical events like Gérôme and David in France. That was sort of the blockbuster of those times. The fact that you could show moving, people moving, things moving was just an amazing discovery. And we'll sort of track how these early innovators dealt with that and how audiences dealt with that. A visual rhetoric, that is an art of persuasion, had to be developed. If you're going to tell a story, if you're going to convince somebody that something is happening, how do you do that in moving pictures? That was sort of the question, and especially given technological limits at the time. So that was something that the early innovators had to deal with. One thing that we can see is that film genres or types became established pretty early on in the evolution of film, and in some ways remain somewhat constant. I mean, we still have heist films, and toward the end of today's presentation, we'll watch Edwin S. Porter's The Great Train Robbery, which in essence is a heist film, and we still have those. So that's a genre or a type of film that has remained constant. People, and this would be a whole nother subject, people seem to enjoy watching something get stolen, if you will, because it's, we can talk about the aesthetic of an operational approach toward that. One thing too that I don't want to give short shrift to is the development of cinema in the United States occurred during a period kind of like our own, in the sense that it was characterized by a high rate of immigration, maybe the highest we've seen in our country's history, urbanization, farm families, the farm population was gravitating toward the cities, accelerating modernization, in other words, in everyday life. For women, it was a period of great social change. Women were moving toward gaining the right to vote. Imagine that. we take women voting now for granted, right? But it wasn't always that way, right? So anyway, cinema, in some ways, it was really fortuitous that the technology of cinema occurred and was developed when it did, because it chronicled a whole episode in our not just our national life, but every industrialized nation's life, because we're going to focus mainly on the United States just because the field is so big. Although we will see some film by Méliès, and later on in the second and third courses, maybe a couple of clips from other filmmakers from outside the US. Okay. All of a sudden, this is not moving. This is locked up. Oh, use the mouse. Okay. Big sign. There. Okay. Thank you very much. Sorry about that. You might be wondering, particularly since I was just talking about a lot of sociological things, why is this a fine arts course? I thought I signed up for a fine arts course. It's went through the fine arts committee. Well, film is, first of all, a two-dimensional medium. Although the illusion, of course, is of 3 dimensions. It's a two-dimensional medium. And so we can look at it fundamentally in terms of the 5 two-dimensional design elements: line, shape, space, color, and texture. So color, not so much, obviously, with silent film, unless films were hand-colored. They're in black and white. But these other elements are very important. So fundamentally, when you're looking at an image, you might start with that approach. What is the design of this composition here? Because as filmmakers got more sophisticated, they really started thinking in compositional terms. And the best filmmakers, the better filmmakers, were always thinking of that, or else it was almost reflective. And this, since most film is mimetic, that is, it seeks to represent the world through lifelike representation, it incorporates linear perspective. And the story, of course, is that when, for instance, the Lumiere brothers first started showing actualités, as they call it, just films of everyday life, of a train coming into a station, people were panicked. They had never seen a moving object come at them, and they were drawn into the illusion. So this is accomplished through the optical apparatus. We enter the scene and become part of it. So those are sort of formal elements of the image that's on the screen. But we can also, and should also, think about a work of film in terms of its content. What are these formal qualities communicating? Are they early film directors, as we saw, as we'll see, made us feel the element of suspense and fear and dread. And this was we'll watch, I think it's the beginning of the next week, we'll watch D.W. Griffith's The Lonely Villa, which was a remake of a couple of another French film, and then a play before that. But you feel this sense of dread and suspense and catharsis, if you will, to bring in that whole approach toward a work of art. In silent film, we can witness the development of a new art form and its mimetic conventions. And we won't use this term a lot because it's one of those highfalutin words, but mise en scène, the positioning, everything that you see, the positioning of actors, the set or locale, the props filling that set or locale, the lighting of the set, the composition of the shot, everything that the filmmaker has at his or her disposal is considered the mise en scène. First, a little bit of a thought experiment to kind of reinforce the reason why we're here. Imagine that imagine that you woke up and there was a new language and that you had never spoken this language. And it was presented to you as merely a form of entertainment. This language, which is so important, the language of images that we're inundated with, we don't imagine that we were ignorant of the grammar. We were just able to speak it, able to understand it, perhaps, at least superficially, but did not really understand the grammar of how the language worked. I think this is a little bit analogous to how moving photographic images, video, if you will, which is so ubiquitous in our culture. When we wake up in the morning, some people watch the news first thing, and they end their day watching the news or a movie or something. It's with us most of our waking hours, at least. So I think it's important, and study of silent film will reinforce this, to understand how this language developed. And as I mentioned earlier, the rhetoric, the art of persuasion that we see in these films. Oddly enough, we'll look at why, very few films survived that era. Cellulose nitrate, which was the film stock that was used, is very fragile and actually flammable, and decays. And most of the films, as you can see from this bar chart, have been lost. In other words, roughly 11,000 silent feature films, those are longer films, a half hour or more, were released from 1912 to 1929, the silent era, and we're not even including the era up to 1912. But only about 14%, maybe 1,575 titles of the feature films produced and distributed in the US during that period exist in their original format. And then there are other categories of how these films survive. Later on, we will look at a film by Oscar Michaud, the first really, maybe the only, not the only, but important Black filmmaker. And we have one copy of Within Our Gates, and it was discovered in Spain. I don't know where in Spain, but and reconstructed. So these films are scarce, despite the fact that so many of these films were made. I mean, the whole nation became obsessed with going to the movies, which was part of the reason so many were made, right? So let's take an overview of the era that we're thinking about. We'll start a little bit earlier, 1895, but from 1900 to 1909, Porter in roughly 1902, working for Edison, releases a couple of films that we'll examine. Porter was influenced by Méliès, and then D.W. Griffith made his debut with The Adventures of Dolly, which was a remake of I believe it was a French film. By 1909, nearly 10,000 movie houses existed, and these were typically storefronts or converted vaudeville theaters, any kind of space at all, particularly in urban areas where people could go and watch movies. So what we're going to do is today we're going to talk about the period from 1895, roughly 1896, to about 1907. Next week, we'll talk about 1907 to roughly the war years. And then in the final session, we'll talk about the Hollywood era. Each is really interesting in its own way and very different. And although categorizing these into eras is not, as is the case with any historical analysis, that simple, and that there are always exceptions, but that's kind of going to be our rubric. So let's talk about what a lot of film scholars call film practice. The persistence of vision effect, which we all have witnessed in some way in our personal lives, is something that was noted long ago. The ancient Greeks knew about it and so forth. Europeans in the late 17th and early in the 1800s created little toys. There was a phenactoscope, a magic disc. Maybe when you were a child, somebody gave you something like this, where if you looked a certain way, you would see a little figure move, just because your brain would process the image at a certain rate. And the physiology of this is really interesting. Of course, we're not going to go into that, but it's just fascinating how that works. So here are a couple of those toys. People were fascinated with the illusion of motion. So human beings seem to want to see things move. In 1877, Charles Reynaud developed a praxinoscope, which was a more elaborate version using mirrors. And he would conduct these magic lantern shows. People would go and watch these productions. And one well-known film scholar, Tom Gunning, has sort of coined a term called the cinema of attractions. In other words, people came to cinema wanting to see a spectacle, wanting to see amazing things move. Early on, the idea that there would be a story to be told, a plot and so forth, wasn't foremost. It was merely to see things. And of course, Edward Muybridge did some pioneering work in photographing horses in motion, and from horses he started photographing people doing various things in a very scientific fashion to understand both the movement and breaking it down into discrete slices, as it were. And this was something that people had never been able to examine what happens when we move or what happens when a horse runs. It was just some things were happening so quickly. The critic Walter Benjamin has a term called the optical unconscious, and photography and later cinema opened up this whole region called the optical unconscious, things that human beings had never seen before, but now we're able to see. Technically, the first motion picture, although it's as you'll see, it's kind of fragmentary, was made arguably by a man named Louis Laprince. And I'll move forward. Here it is. Just a very small fragment, 1888. Let's shift a little bit to Edison and what he was doing. Edison had an assistant, W.K.L. Dixon, from whom we'll hear more of as the silent era unfolds. And he was kind of Edison's right-hand man when it came to inventing photographic apparatus. And Edison challenged Dixon to design a motion picture camera. And through the work of Maré and Muybridge, it was pretty well understood that you would have a series of photographs that would be shown in rapid fashion. And so Dixon in 1890 devised a system that Edison dubbed the kinetograph, had a synchronized shutter and sprocket system so that the film could advance and then stop, and advance and stop, and so forth, at a high rate of speed. In May 1891, this was demonstrated. In 1894, it began commercial operation. And here's W.K.L. Dixon on his own machine. This is called Dixon's Greek.
From the Library of Congress in Washington, D.C.
So not very impressive by our standards, but for the time, a huge technological achievement. So Edison, always interested in the business side, decided to use this technology, and Dixon helped him do this, and they created what's called a kinetoscope. And it was really kind of a peep show kind of a thing with a cabinet maybe about this size of this lectern, and you would look down in it and you would see a loop of these images, and you would see things like, well, here's Fred Ott's Sneeze, another important early film. So this is what human beings were, everyday things were fascinating. Edison built the first movie studio, which was called the Black Maria. I guess that's how you would pronounce it. The world's first film production studio in West Orange, New Jersey. And many of the short films released after 1895 were filmed there if they weren't filmed actually on location someplace. But if you were to go to a kinetoscope parlor, this is what you might see. So the idea that you could go and watch this woman dance where you just endlessly, this was how things were moving along. It's still pretty early, 1894, 1895. So you would pay a nickel or something to watch that. Maybe might have been a quarter. Meanwhile, and I'm going to pick up the pace here a little bit because I want to, we've got a lot of ground to cover. The Americans were not the only ones working with film, of course. The French, the British, Germans, everybody wanted to get in on this. It was a sort of an international thing, although things were moving independently. The Lumiere brothers, Auguste and Louis, came up with a brilliant camera called a cinematograph, which was a camera and a printer, as well as a projector. And it ran at 16 frames per second, which was kind of developed into a more or less a standard speed for silent film. It was hand cranked rather than using an electric motor, which made it more compact. Edison's kinetograph used a battery to power the motor. So in 1895, the Lumiere brothers launched their public careers with a display of the cinematograph's capabilities. And this was projected film. And this was a huge difference because Edison saw the commercial potential of his peep show, the kinetoscope, and so why do we want to project things? That's working in the wrong direction. You can have 30 people watch one projection, whereas I can have 30 people using 30 machines and have each one pay individually. So this kind of held him back, his approach on this. But the Lumiere brothers were doing very well. Supposedly they took in more than $40,000 a day equivalent in after they started regular showing. So the French were a force to be reckoned with in film world already. Now, as we talked about, and again, if you ever have any comments or questions, please just raise your hand. What were people interested in? What did they use this technology for? I don't know if you, when you were a boy or a girl, ever had a tape recorder. When I was a boy, getting a tape recorder was just an amazing thing. I mean, you could tape what was going on around you, your parents' voices, your voice, everything sounded different. And that was sort of the way I think that people viewed early film. For instance, here, the Lumiere brothers film people coming out of a factory in Lyon. That is a big dog. Just running around. But at their first organized program showing, the Lumiere brothers had, I think, 17 of these actualities. Anyway, a number of these actualities kind of packaged as a program. And I think challenges for us to put ourselves in the shoes and the frame of mind of someone in that era, being able to see everyday things. Anyway, get the idea. Now, that's all very well and good, actualities, watching trains and people coming out of factories, but what about the creative spirit? What about actually using film in a frankly artistic way? One of the things that I want to really focus on in this series of talks is women's role in cinema, because the way things worked out, I hope we talk about this, women played a really important part in cinema early on. It was an open field, and for the most part, compared with a lot of other fields at the time. And that changed in the 20s when film became industrialized in Hollywood and consolidated with the major motion picture makers. But anyway, one of the first important women in film, period, worldwide, was Alice Guy. And then she married and became Alice Guy Blaché. But here, I think this is her first or surviving first film. May not be all of it, but I'm showing you enough so you can get the idea. La Fée aux Choux, the Cabbage Fairy, which, if you know anything about the French, they have this sort of fairy tale. They tell kids that little babies are found in the cabbage patch. Anyway. And by the way, this is Alice Guy Blaché acting. Luckily, it's a silent film, right? No, that's a good point. This was added later, but I kept them because it, I'm sorry, it seemed appropriate. That's a dog, luckily. But I don't know how this strikes you. I'd be interested in your reactions, but Yeah. Any thoughts, any reactions? Can you put yourselves in the shoes of maybe a French person? This is, I don't know, there's a night, go ahead, Tom.
Like I can imagine, because these are kind of legends of the, the culture.
Mhm.
I can imagine either being excited to see this being played out.
Sorry, Tom, we have to slow people down.
It being because part of the culture. I can imagine being excited to see this being played out. I can also imagine people being offended by this representation of something that they imagine quite differently.
That's true. Yeah. Interesting. Tom was just saying that making explicit this cultural, well, the word hadn't been invented yet, meme would strike people in different ways. Yes. I guess you're supposed to get the microphone. Sorry.
Well, one thing that struck me, when you think about France, you think about the whole idea of mimes. And basically the way she's acting there
Yeah.
is kind of like, a Marcel Marceau
Great.
kind of a mime, but differently because the audience is only in one place and you're not having to deal with, invisible walls and trying to do that kind of a
Right.
thing. But that just struck me.
No,
there, that it
you're
was-
absolutely right, because as we'll see in other films, as we go on through the silent era, the way actors approached their craft in silent era was changed completely with sound. And a lot of people bemoaned this but we'll see them exaggerate things sometimes. And I think the best ones exaggerated, but it still looked kind of natural. And we'll show next week, we'll see Mary Pickford in a really interesting film. Actually a couple, and yeah, the great actors were able to do that and mime things, because that's what you have to go on. You don't have the audio. So here's a little bit more about Alice Guy Blaché, arguably the first filmmaker. She was very enterprising and very energetic. She was a big influence on Hitchcock, Eisenstein, and others. Quite a woman, as was Mary Pickford and lots of other women. But the industrialization, yes.
Correct me if I'm wrong, but I believe that she was originally hired by Gaumont as a secretary and
Right.
made her first films on her lunch hour.
That could, yeah, I know she was first a secretary for Gaumont. So it sounds like you've done your own research. So keep me honest if I say anything that is misleading, or which I hope not to, but good. I'm glad you understand that. Yes, she came in as an underling and quickly distinguished herself. And we'll see that also with Griffith and others too, Porter as well. Good points. Yes. I guess you need the mic. Sorry about that.
I find that second paragraph interesting about film in the year 2000. Wondered if men and women have reversed roles by the year 2000. I'm curious what would have, if you know what may have piqued her curiosity about that, or something had happened at the time that caused someone to wonder those things.
If I understand you, what prompted Alice Guy Blaché or Guy, I think at that time, to go into filmmaking?
No, look at the last sentence of the second paragraph. In the year 1912, they're wondering if men and women have reversed roles by the year 2000.
Yeah, I'm sorry. Yeah.
What in culture at the time may have prompted that, or what in the mind? Do you have any cue as to what in the mind of the person would have triggered wondering that, and then to make a film about it?
No, that's a great point. And yeah, sorry, I misunderstood there. Really a fascinating idea, something that maybe a woman would particularly be interested in. And then she would have the means to and the skill to explore that in cinema at that time. It's really mind-boggling in a way. But she's not the only one. We'll talk about Lois Weber, an American woman director and actually an actress too. And she did several films that really pushed the boundaries that men were not interested in pushing, just to be frank. So another reason to be interested in this era and to bemoan in some ways the industrialization of filmmaking. But hopefully we can talk more about that. So as I mentioned, we'll move along because we've got a lot more to cover. Originally, Edison resisted projection. He always had his eye on the bottom line, and but apparently he went to France in the summer of 1895, and he saw this the Lumiere brothers cinematograph, and he went back to Dixon and said, let's make a projection device. Meanwhile, the world was not standing still, and some American inventors, Thomas Armot and Charles Jenkins, had invented what they called a phantascope. And Edison figured, why reinvent the wheel? There's a perfectly good projector system here. I'm gonna buy it, and I'm gonna rename it Vitascope. That's compressing what happened. Didn't necessarily happen quite as easily as that, but and in the process, the Latham loop, which was an essential component of film projection was also incorporated. So in 1896, Edison presented the first Vitascope motion picture in the United States in New York. So by 1896, Edison was utilizing projection technology, and I will be quoting Charles Musser a lot because he's really a wonderful expert in this era. And he says projecting machines were invented independently and more or less simultaneously in France, England, Germany, and the United States. And kind of reminiscent of what has gone on in our era with computer technology coming from just different areas and then slowly getting standardized. Now, film scholars talk about 1896 and 97 as the novelty year, at least some scholars do. And one of the things we really want to focus on here is not even so much we've got the filmic object, as they call it. We've got the technology. We've got what the producer does to make this filmic object. But the other component that's so important is spectatorship. You know, people before projected film or even the peep shows, people would do other things, right? I mean, they would go to vaudeville perhaps, or music halls, or they'd go to the saloon. You know, people did different things. And all of a sudden you had something called spectatorship that producers and exhibitors were developing. And as I mentioned, actualities, various acts, people said, well, let's just kind of incorporate this into our vaudeville show. We'll have a juggling act, and then a comedy act, and then a singer, and then let's show a little film, and then we'll go back to maybe a minstrel. And so that's kind of how film started to get incorporated into entertainment. Films were regarded as living pictures, spectacles, recordings of real events. And as we talked about, the novelty really overshadowed everything. Audiences expected films to present something, a spectacle, something that you would go to see, not so much represent in terms of content. And again, David Cook says very well, for filmmakers and audiences alike, early cinema was conceived as a series of displays, providing spectatorial pleasure through all of the objects, views, and events it could show, whether fictional or documentary, and whether in story form or not. We're going to increasingly focus on story form as we go along. One of the people we really need to pay homage to is Georges Méliès, the great French film director, although I don't know if he would have recognized that term of director. He was a magician and worked at the Houdin Theater Robert Houdin Theater in Paris. And he heard about the Lumiere brothers and what they were doing, went to one of their first exhibitions and tried to buy a camera from them, and they turned him down. Why exactly? I'm not sure. Maybe they did not want a competitor, perhaps. He ended up reverse engineering, buying a projector from a British competitor of the Lumiere brothers, and then reverse engineering a camera. And then he went on to make 500 films between more than 500 films between 1896 and 1913, and including some as long as 40 minutes. And his work is just really delightful. As we'll see, he did not move his camera. Everything was in what might be called a tableau presentation. In Méliès, the camera stays put. But he did lots of other things to thrill people in the way that when people nowadays go to a Star Wars film, they're wowed by these special effects. And we'll look at a couple of things here. This is from 1896. He uses stop action photography to really work magic. He'll stop the camera and then start it with something. This is called Le Manoir du Diable, the house of the devil, I guess. Arguably the first horror film. We won't watch the whole thing, but this was just magic to people. But you get the idea that one thing I might note too is in terms of the quality of the film, what we're looking at in terms of the quality may not have been the condition of the films when they were first exhibited. It's been a long time for some of these films, like this one was lost, presumed lost, and then a copy was made. So what we're watching is a copy of an old cellulose nitrate film. So I think chances are the projected image that Méliès's viewers would have seen would have been a little higher quality. Yes. I'm going to stop this.
So you talked about in the US, the number of films that were made and the few that are preserved.
Yeah.
And from an international perspective, is the situation the same, or in different countries was preservation more robust? You know, what's the difference?
That is an excellent question, and I do not have a ready answer. It's something that I could look up unless somebody else in the audience has knowledge of that. I don't know. Did you in your research? Have you? I don't know. That's really a good question, and I probably should know that. I'll see what I can find out about that. My guess is, given the fact that we had 2 world wars, that things were in the interim probably even worse, but I could be wrong about that. So good question though. One of the things, again, silent film, there's no dialogue other than that provided, and we'll talk about this by perhaps a lecturer who might be talking during a film. That was common practice as silent film evolved. You would have a lecturer, you would have maybe an organ player, a piano player. One of the ways that filmmakers would try to help audiences understand their narratives was to use titles and inserts. And here are a couple of examples. Supposedly Edwin S. Porter was one of the first, it's hard to say who was the first to use so-called intertitles, but as we'll see as we watch film, it became pretty important. And it was arguable at the time. Some critics thought some films had too many titles and others not enough. But the really big issue was, how can people understand what's going on the screen when you're trying to tell a story? Because typically filmmakers would, at the beginning of the era, use fairy tales or commonly known tropes, so people could tell what was going to happen. Goldilocks and the Three Bears, or something like that. Because a lot of the early audiences did not all speak English. A lot of them were recent immigrants, and they spoke a multitude of languages. And so whatever you did, you had to be able to overcome that. And they came from different backgrounds. Goldilocks and the Three Bears might not be a Romanian folktale, whereas it might be for folks from France or someplace. So anyway, Méliès, illusionist extraordinaire. All the early filmmakers and actors paid him homage. We're going to watch a little bit of The Voyage to the Moon, so we can get a little idea of how magnificent his productions were. This was based on, of course, this story by Jules Verne. Now, I should point out that, again, we were transported back to when this film was first shown. There would be a lecturer telling the story, scene by scene, of what's going on to reinforce. Here are the scientists coming in, the wise men. They're having a meeting, and so forth and so on. Notice that the camera is not moving. It's as if we were sitting in a theater. Convention theater. There's definitely a comedic element in this. Poking fun at the scientific, the 20 hat. Reaches a dissolve there. Change his scene. like Mickey Pioneer. Notice how we want to see what that guy on the left is doing, but the camera's not moving. Phenomenal effects, the smoke. The water. Here's the delegation entering the recorded the entire frame. It wasn't. I don't know why it just didn't move. It could be there's something I don't know about. We do move it and done. Very French. Everybody. No pomp and circumstance. After all, this is a voyage to it. One of the most iconic scenes in film history. To your point about timing, it is very important. As I'm sure Haley wanted to do, right? Earthrise. Well, I'm going to stop it because we have a lot to go cover today, but I think you get the idea of how extraordinary Méliès was. His imagination, and although he's thinking primarily in conventional stage theatrical terms, he still was using some of the technological capabilities of film way beyond his time. The fade in, fade out, he would overlap, he would dissolve, and of course, stop motion, which he claimed he discovered by accident, which may very well have been true. The storytelling is non-linear. we'll talk more about that. This film was so popular that it was pirated by Americans, Lubin, Selig, Edison, and others. It was just a big hit. It was sort of like the Star Wars of the time, if you can imagine that. And as I said, the narrative would have filled in for audiences and helped them to understand what was going on. Let's move on to Edwin S. Porter, an American, and his contributions, and in the time that we have left, and hopefully with a little time for discussion. I won't read all of this. You're welcome to read it, but he became the most influential filmmaker in the United States in the early part of the century. And we're going to watch two versions of Life of an American Fireman. Keep in mind that all these films, Méliès was kind of a pioneer in another way. His films were longer, tended to be a little longer than most of the other filmmakers. Another reason to admire his genius. And then Porter left Edison eventually after making a number of films and had an interesting career, but he was a really seminal figure in American filmmaking. So what we're talking about here is the transition from actualities to story films, and where Méliès fits in, maybe we just need to bracket him for a minute, but for the most part, film needed to make a transition to story films from actualities and spectacle. And Porter was instrumental in kind of making this contribution. In other words, developing a narrative style. Film scholar Tom Gunning, early cinema did not see its main task as the presentation of narratives. We've talked about that. And we're going to focus in on this period of working to develop a narrative conventions and style. One of the stock figures, probably maybe hearkening back to vaudeville, was the Rube figure. And there were a number of Uncle Josh films. Uncle Josh is kind of a rube who doesn't really know what he's doing and gets taken. But let's watch this short here. You got to pay attention closely to what goes on. Lady drops her handkerchief. Josh picks it up. They go in to have a cup of coffee or something, or maybe something a little stronger. He's in the big city. Now watch what she does while he looks away. So he's flattered by the attention. Good watch. Bids him goodbye. He gets thrown out. Now, interesting trend. Pay attention to this transition. We're now exterior shot. There's Josh getting thrown in the wagon. Suitcase follows. The way that action was repeated is the non-linear form of storytelling that we're going to see a lot of, and eventually filmmakers would work out excuse me, what was kind of became the classical Hollywood linear form of storytelling. But early on, a lot of times things, and we'll see this in the next film, Life of an American Fireman, and there are actually two versions of this film, and we're going to watch both. It's a pretty short film, but it's a really important film to look at early struggles with how to tell a story from different standpoints and how to convey the flow of time in a smooth narrative style. The original version is now by most scholars thought to be the Library of Congress version. And this was on a paper negative, if you can imagine that. And then there was a later version that was discovered that is in the collection of the Museum of Modern Art, which has, and we'll watch and we'll examine this, a number of what are called intercuts and switching points of view. And that is, for a long time, people thought, boy, Porter was an incredible genius. Look at this film. He had all these intercuts back in 1903. Well, he was a genius, but those changes were made later, and they're not sure who made those. We know why they made them, because the film flows a lot better, as we'll see. But I think this is a really interesting case study. So Life of an American Fireman, which again was a common trope in early filmmaking, fires, fire engines, very exciting for people at that time, still is, I guess, but yeah, that's true. Could we turn down the room lights? I don't know if we can or not. That's a good question. That's a good point. I hadn't thought of that. Is that better? Okay, here we go. Library of Congress version. This was the original, felt by all, pretty much all scholars now, original version. Whoop. Now I gotta use the mouse. Sorry. Used up my one pre-advance. There we go. So the fire chief is dreaming of, not sure if it's his wife and child. You know, he's a fire chief, but not every fireman has a roll top. He's worried. He's not right. Somebody pulls the fire alarm. Actually an interior shot. It wasn't supposed to be interior at all, that was shot outside. Harnessing the teams for the dogs. Exterior. This would have been thrilling to people at the time. What kind of horses? What skills? More and more fire. Okay, the arrival at the fire is coming up. Notice the panning shot. A little panning there. Now a complete pan. Very innovative. Notice the sequence of events that are very important. Milestones. Doesn't take him long to do that. You can trust the time. As he's the cello. He edits the signature up there. Now they show the same thing on the outside.
When the watchman's cry at midnight strikes our ear, and the flames high rising start a waking tear, then the firemen onward rush where danger lies, to quench the mighty
You
flames that
understand, we're seeing this now from the exterior, the same thing we saw from the interior, now we're seeing from the exterior.
Mother wild, exclaiming,
That's the argument.
"See the rooms on fire and save my child, He rushes through terrific flames amidst
Takes a lot more time for them to go back into the get the child than the earlier sequence.
its mother's
Right?
arms. He rushes through terrific flames amidst all arms, and nobly bears the
Cries out,
smiling babe
"Rescue
to
my
its
child,
mother's
rescue my
arms,
child."
into its mother's arms, into its mother's arms, mother's arms, mother's arms.
So now we will watch the same film. The first part of the film is the same, so just bear with me, watch it again and try to appreciate it. From the time of the arrival at the fire, pay particular attention to the sequence of shots. Because rather than looking at things in terms of scenes, Porter was looking not only at scenes, but also shots. Or actually the editor of this version. This is the newer version that was edited to modern storytelling conventions. What we saw with the one we just saw was you tell a story, you tell what happened from the interior, and then you go back and you go outside and then you tell it again from the outside. Which to us is an awkward way of telling a story, although it's a classical way of a lot of great epic poems do that, right? They'll tell the story from one standpoint, but film, they were still trying to figure this out. Film does it differently now, typically. Oh, that's right, I edited to just show from the, sorry. So this is from the arrival. I saved this a couple of minutes. Okay, we're interior, she gets up. Cut to the outside. Cut back to the inside. Cut back out. Cut in. Cut out. So this is called intercutting. Back inside for parallel editing. Back outside. Back inside to rescue the child. Back outside. And then back inside to put out the fire. Okay. So yeah, it would have been, it could be an organ or a piano. Right. That was typically the case. Although, yeah, I think that would have been the scenario. Yeah. So I don't know how it struck you. It may not have seemed that important to you, but in terms of storytelling and narrative, there's a huge difference between the two in terms of how we are used to consuming films. Huge difference. And I actually had, I don't know what happened to it. Doesn't matter because we're going to move right along, but I actually listed the various cuts, and there, I think there are 9 scenes in the original version and 16 in the second, 9 shots versus 16. And that's a tremendous difference, back and forth, to give you the sense of you're moving along in time with the event, rather than as a spectator, there's still that distance of, oh, I'm watching it now, then I'll watch it again. There's a tremendous mimetic difference in that. It's, I'm going to try to get in, or I might save it for next week, Great Train Robbery. So the single reel was about the standard film length for a number of years, because producers could just churn these things out. It just became such a booming business. It was incredible. And that hence, as we saw, thousands and thousands of films were produced, because one reel, you didn't need to change the reel. It was just a nice, convenient unit. Porter made a couple of really interesting films called The Ex-Convict and The Kleptomaniac. The Ex-Convict, kind of an argument against class bias and a question of justice. And then The Kleptomaniac is about a banker's wife. And it's just some progressive kind of edgy stuff for the time, certainly. I think we have time to watch this. I'll try to get it in this week. Huge hit. This was just another blockbuster for Edison, and pay particular attention to the shots, interior, exterior, and also the narrative technique. Just meticulously detailed how these guys do this robbery. Tom Gunning calls it an operational aesthetic. The reporter is filming the shot with a projected image of what you might see from a moving train. Give you the illusion. Yeah. Very violent. This is something we'll talk about too. We even have a lecturer kind of recapping what's going on in case people imitating maybe emotional drama. These are bad guys, right? Again, the camera's not moving. Everything's. Okay. Kids. Staple of early filmmaking space. Another iconic shot. Well, I cut it pretty close. It's by my watch. It's just now 11 or 10:59. So what we'll do next week is we will pick up here. We've still got some more stuff to discuss rather. So think about this. If you have any questions, bring them next week, and hope you enjoyed this first installment.